The Rebel Capitalist Show.
So tell us about this. I believe it's a recent book that you wrote on taxes and government and how that interplays with war and maybe even Bitcoin and gold. That interview you had with Raul that I listened to was absolutely fascinating. And as soon as I listened to it, I texted my assistant and said, "You've got to get Dominic on my show to talk about this new book." So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so this is my book, Daylight. My big theory in the world used to be that if we're going to save the world, we need to fix money. We need to get rid of fiat money and go back to, I call it independent money, whether it's gold or silver or Bitcoin or wherever it is. But government, we need to stop. We need to take away. Money needs to be apolitical. The state can't have the power to create money. And that's how we save the world. And then that thinking evolved into taxation. I started thinking, actually, we need to, if we're going to fix the world, you design a society by the way you tax it. You design the incentives for that society. You design, you determine how free that its people are going to be, or how subordinated, how prosperous, how poor. And then I started to look back through history, and then I realized that there's never been a civilization in history that didn't have taxes of some kind. And even the libertarian digital idyll that is Bitcoin has taxes in the form of miners' fees. Taxation, as your great leader Benjamin Franklin once said, like death, is inevitable. And so this book, Daylight Robbery, is an attempt to make the argument, to just make people aware. Nobody talks about taxes except to moan about, how much tax they have to pay. But nobody looks at the world through the prism of tax. Nobody thinks about it, realizes, how important tax should be a subject that we teach at school, like chemistry and maths. That's how big a part of our education it should occupy. And you don't just design a society and determine its destiny by the way you tax it. But then you actually start looking back through history and you realize that every great event in history, bar none, has got some kind of untold tax story behind it, without which the events would have turned out very differently. And so I'll give you a little challenge, George. We'll have a bit of fun. I just want you to shout out events from history, random events, and I'll attempt to tell you what the untold tax story was behind that event.
World War II.
Okay, so every war, every single war is made possible by taxes. If there were no taxes, you could not have war because there would be no means of paying for it. And those taxes either happen during the event or they take the form of debt. I regard debt as a tax on the future because it is going to be paid back by some form of taxation, whether it's actually paid back or whether that taxation takes the form of inflation. But every war is paid for by some kind of tax. And not only that, it's not just that tax makes war possible, it's that war makes tax possible. Every war involves the imposition of new taxes that would not have been viable in peacetime. It's only the crisis that gives people the possibility of taxes. Right. And so in America, you got your 1942 Revenue Act, which brought income tax to every man. Prior to 1942, income tax was only paid by the richest Americans. And there was a huge campaign. There was a video of Donald Duck patriotically going to pay his tax that was circulated. And there was Irving Berlin was commissioned to write a song which goes, "I paid my income tax today." And if you listen to the lyric of that song, it goes, "1,000 planes to bomb Berlin. They've got to be paid for, and I chipped in. That certainly makes me feel okay. I paid my income tax today," or something like that. And so was ever the link between war and tax more starkly stated? And Americans were like, yeah, we're going to bomb Berlin. Let's pay our income tax. Now, the thing is,
did they pitch it as temporary back then? Not the income tax in total, but the income tax affecting the broad population.
I don't know the answer to that, but I would say almost certainly yes.
Right. Yeah.
And because what always happens is that after the crisis has passed, the taxation, the control never goes back to the levels it was before the crisis
Right.
started. They
Right.
stay. And
Mhm.
you got it with your 19, and the very first income tax came to America actually in 1861, I'm going to say, or 1862 maybe. Lincoln imposed it
For the Civil
um,
War.
to pay for his war, and it was abandoned about 1875. It went away.
Well, that's good to know that that income tax was actually abandoned. Uh, there's hope. Okay,
Yeah,
so when you say that the taxes shape society, I'm assuming you're talking about the differences between like a consumption tax, an income tax, a wealth tax, and how, do you have more of one and less of the other, or tariffs, something like that? In your study, did you see a certain system that seemed to work better consistently throughout not only different time frames, but in different countries?
yeah. Well, the answer to all of those questions is yes. The taxation is almost like a measure of freedom.
Yeah,
The
right.
degree to which you're taxed is Margaret Thatcher used to say you can't have freedom without economic freedom.
Mm,
And I like to look on it as how of a worker's, how much of his labor does a man own?
right.
And and in the States at the moment, I think it's what, 40%, something like that. Um, in taxes as a proportion of GDP, excluding inflation, are around about 45%, I think, in the States. But what's the higher rate income tax in the States? Is it 40%?
Currently, it's almost 40%, but then you've got to add on state taxes, in
Okay,
which
so
case, like California, it can really, really go up, and that's just income tax.
so the ordinary worker doesn't own that much of his own labor, even in the free country that is the United States. Is worse in Europe. We have higher taxes. Now, if you look at North Korea or some totalitarian state, the worker owns none of his labor.
Right, right,
It's all taken. It's all owned by the government. And in a slave, if you have a slave, that slave owns. He doesn't even own his own body, let alone his own labor. And then at the other, so that's one extreme. And then at the other extreme, you have an anarchy where there's no taxes at all, and that's total freedom. And our sort of social democracies are sort of somewhere in the middle of those two extremes.
hmm
Now, if you look at the most successful, the most innovative, the most inventive, the greatest countries in history, the greatest societies, they all started out at least with very low levels of taxation. 10, 15, 20% of GDP, these kinds of things. Hong Kong, the great economic success story of the second half of the 20th century, taxation as a proportion of GDP never exceeded 14%. And it was only the very rich who paid income tax.
right,
Anyone below the super rich in Hong Kong, their labor was theirs to keep. They owned their own labor. The tax system was based more around taxing land, taxing the value of land than it was labor. And that's a very different society that you create.
right, right.
Um,
And the
you know,
incentive structure is completely different.
totally, because if you have a land value tax, for example, and you want, I want to occupy the idea of a land value tax, the philosophy of it is that um, man didn't make the land, Mother Nature created the land, or God created the land, whoever the super whatever being is. Um, and if and man built what's on the land, but the land in its unimproved state should belong to everyone. And if you want exclusive rights to a plot of land, then and you want the government to protect your title to that land, then you need to pay a fee to the community for that exclusive right. And
Mm,
that fee would be a portion, 5 or 10% of his annual rental value or something like that. And that's a tax based around use, but what you consume, what you
right, right,
use,
right, right,
rather than how productive you are.
right.
And it just totally changes the way the gearing of society. If I think if people could keep all of the proceeds of their own labor, then they'd probably be more productive because there's a
Mm,
bigger incentive to be productive. The tithe, like, even though income tax was only really a 20th, maybe the first income taxes were probably in the Napoleonic War, around about then, beginning of the 19th century. But this idea of the tithe, where you give a tenth of what you earn to the church, it predates Christianity. It goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, the first civilization. But it wouldn't have been paid in money. It would have been paid in your time, in your produce. You give a share of your whatever you farm, you give to your local lord, who would often be, king, god, lord, church. They were much more intermingled back then than they are now,
Right.
less differentiated. But there have been societies in history where taxation was voluntary. And again, we have forced taxation. You have this amount. It's often deducted before you even receive it if you're working for somebody else. You never actually get the money you earned and hand it over. It's taken at source, and it's forced from you. Nobody says thank you. You don't have any relationship. Like, if you could see my taxes went to pay for the road that's outside my house. So if you actually paid the the man who makes the road to build that road outside your house, and you could actually monitor him building that road and make sure he builds it to a high enough standard so you get your value for money, it creates a very different incentive structure. That whole accountability is gone. And it happens more when taxes are collected at the local level. But when taxes are collected at the federal level by some decentralized body, I don't even know where the IRS is. It's in some ridiculous part of America, but where is the IRS? It's everywhere and nowhere. But when there's no accountability, I think it's very important in the process of giving to get some gratitude. It really is. Otherwise, where's the incentive? And so if taxes were voluntary, or you could actually say, I want to pay a bit of extra tax today, but I want that extra tax to go to building this road in my street. And in exchange for this extra tax going on my street, I want a little plaque. It's only going to cost you £5 to put the plaque up that says Dominic Frisby paid this tax for this road in this street. Thank you very much, Dominic Frisby. And if you had those kind of incentives, I think a lot of the time, the evidence of history in societies where taxes were voluntary, and you could actually see if you were responsible for carrying out the work done or overlooking it, the evidence is people paid more than they were obliged to. And it created a greater loyalty to the society. Whereas with forced taxation that we have now, the onus is on paying as little as you legally can. So the incentives are all wrong.